Hello again. So today I'm going to attempt to replace the BIOS chip on my Lenovo Mix 700. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, it just packed up on me, hit the power button, I get the power light come on, but it doesn't want to boot up. Did quite a bit of research on the internet, forums, etc. And having spoken to Lenovo support, it appears that the BIOS is being corrupted. So it's either brick it or have a go at replacing the chip. So I've got nothing to lose. I managed to get the chip from eBay for £10. I'll show you in more detail shortly. However, there is a problem. Although I'm reasonably comfortable with replacing surface mount components, this chip doesn't have any legs. Let me show you what I mean. So let me take the BIOS out of this packaging. Okay, there you go. So I'll try to get this as close as I can without it blaring. So you can see there, the legs, well, they don't exist. If we compare that to a regular BIOS chip, now this isn't the Mix 700's motherboard, but you can see clearly that this BIOS chip here does have these metal legs that solder onto the pads on the motherboard. So it's going to be interesting, but let's see how we get on. So here's the issue with the machine. You switch the power on, you can see we get the power light comes on, but the machine doesn't boot up. I've tried holding down the volume rocker and power for 15 seconds for a hard reset, but to no avail. So the next 3 minutes of this video shows the steps required to gain access to the BIOS chip on the Lenovo Mix 700. If you're just interested in seeing the BIOS chip replacement, please feel free to skip this section. As always, take extra care when releasing ribbon cables. Ensure that you release the locking flap if it has one. I can verify that every ribbon cable connected to the motherboard on the Mix 700 does have a locking flap. You can then use a small Phillips screwdriver to undo all of the screws that's attaching the motherboard to the casing. This is definitely work that you don't want to rush, so take your time and take lots of pictures as you go through the stages, so you'll have a reference when it comes to reassembly in case you get stuck. If your screwdriver isn't magnetic, try to get hold of a little magnet for this job. Definitely useful for collecting the tiny screws. So the BIOS chip is located on the reverse of the motherboard behind the copper heat shield. Just get that into focus, and you'll notice that the legs, well, they aren't actually legs. What you're looking at is just simply solder joints. So before we apply the hot air gun to this BIOS chip, we just want to try to soften these soldered joints using flux and soldering iron. This will help immensely when we hit this chip with the hot air gun. It should come off a lot easier. Removing a chip obviously takes patience, and you certainly don't want to use any force to prise it off. Temperature of between 400 and 450 and fan speed set between 4 and 5 works well for me. And here's the legless BIOS chip. So you want to get some flux on both the pads on the motherboard and on the replacement BIOS chip. I also find that tinning the connections on the BIOS chip just helps when resoldering back to the motherboard. You're now ready to align the replacement chip onto the motherboard. Now, I should have mentioned earlier, you need to ensure that you get the orientation correct. Now, usually there's a round circle etched into one of the corners, and that's what you'll use for your identifier. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to zoom in any closer, but as soon as you see your solder turn from a solid to a liquid, that's your cue to remove the heat gun. And if you're happy that all 8 connections are soldered firmly, that's it, job done. Just clean up any excess flux with a good alcohol solution. So I hope you found this useful. Any questions, as always, please leave in the comments below. And I'll end with a close-up of the newly installed chip. And see you on the next video.